I'm going to get you started on Lab 44, Student Names and Grades. In this program, you are going to save the names of 5 students and their course grades in parallel arrays. Now, parallel arrays are just 2 arrays that have data that's related, and the data at each subscript or index is what is related. So in both arrays, the data at subscript 0 is somehow related, and the data at subscript 1 is somehow related, and so on. So your program should output the content of both arrays, find the student with the highest score, and output the student name with the highest score along with his or her score. Create an array of strings of size 5 called student name, and a parallel array of integers called student grade. Okay, so there's our 2 parallel arrays. We're going to have a student name array of strings, and then we're going to have a student grade array made up of scores that are of type int. We will initialize our student name array with an initialization list using the following names. So our student names are going to be Amanda Baines, Victor Hughes, Scott Collins, Lori Macbeth, and Manny Lopez. Now, once again, it's referencing 7-4 like it did in the last assignment, so I'm going to pull that up. 7-4 is an example of an array of strings called planets. Now, we're going to have something very similar here, but our array is going to be of student names. So instead of Mercury here, we're going to have Amanda Baines. The second name is Victor Hughes, the third name is Scott Collins, and so on. So that's what will go in our array of student names. And that's how we will initialize our array of student names, using an initialization list very similar to this array of planets. All right, next we're going to read in the grade of each student into the student grade array. And it tells you to look at 7-15 for an example. So in 7-15, it is showing us how to read data into 2 parallel arrays. In this example, we have 2 arrays, one called hours and one called pay rate. These arrays have related data. They're parallel arrays. So in other words, the hours at index 0 belongs to the same employee as the pay rate at index 0. So what we're going to do in this program is first prompt the user to enter the hours worked by employees and their hourly pay rate, and then we iterate through this loop. Notice our counter here is index, so that is also the subscript into our parallel arrays. The first prompt is hours worked by employee number, and then this is offset by 1. This is our counter plus 1. The reason we have plus 1 here is because humans start counting at 1, even though computers start counting at 0. So hours worked by employee 1, colon, and then we're going to read that value into hours sub 0. That's because the first element in our array has a subscript of 0. Now, the next prompt is the hourly pay rate for employee 1, and then we're going to read that value into pay rate sub 0. So the hours and the pay rate have related information. It's for the first employee. This loop will hit the close curly brace, increment the counter to 2, and then test is 2 less than the number of employees. Well, the number of employees is 5, so this is going to be true. So it will output hours worked by employee number 2, and then it's going to read the data into hours sub 1. This is the second element in our hours array. Then we prompt the user to enter the hourly pay rate for employee 2, and then we read that value into pay rate sub 1. So I'm going to run this program and show you what it's actually doing in the console window. And I'm going to make this smaller so that you can see it a little bit better and try to see the code at the same time. So if I move this here, scroll here, there's our for loop, get that back up. Okay. Enter the hours worked by 5 employees and their hourly pay rates. Hours worked by employee 1. We're in the first iteration of this loop. That was output by this line right here. So I'm just going to say the first Employee worked 15 hours, and the first employee is paid at a rate of $10.25 an hour. When I hit enter, I'm going to be in the second iteration of my for loop, and I'm referring to this for loop right here. So I'm going to enter the data, and every time I get prompted for hours worked by employee number, I'm at the next iteration of the loop. So I'm going to say that employee 2 worked 16 hours at a rate of $15 an hour. Employee 3 worked 3 hours at a rate of $14.25 an hour. Employee 4 worked 20 hours at a rate of $25 an hour. And employee 5 worked 19 hours at a rate of $42 an hour. All right, when I hit enter, my program continues with the code that follows this for loop. So it's going to output, here's the gross pay for each employee, and then I go through another for loop and I iterate through my parallel arrays using my counter of my for loop. And what I'm doing at each iteration of the loop is outputting the data for each employee. So employee number 1 and his pay. His gross pay is calculated by multiplying the related data in each of the arrays. So hour sub 0 times pay rate sub 0 is the pay for employee 1. When I reach the curly brace, I go to the update section. My index counter becomes a 1, and then is 1 less than or equal to 5? Well, that's true. So I'm going to go to the next iteration and calculate the gross pay for employee 2 and then output employee 2's data. This will repeat for each element in both of my hours and pay rate arrays. Our next bullet says, in a for loop, print the name of each student left justified in a field width of 15. So we need 2 IO manipulators here, left and set W. And then we also have to output the grade of the student right justified in a field width of 3. So then we're going to have to switch from left to right. So we'll need the right manipulator, a set W3, and then we're going to output student grade sub I, if I is our counter in our loop, because that needs a subscript, an index. All right, and then after that, we need to determine the highest score achieved by a student and display the student's name and the score. I tell you, I will be grading this lab with a script. If you do not use parallel arrays and do not find and use the index of the person with the highest score, you will not receive credit. I will change your grade in Blackboard to reflect this. So in other words, follow these instructions. Do what I've asked you to do so that you can get full credit. All right, it says check slide 3 of the 7C PowerPoint for the code to find the highest value in the array. All right, so I'm going to pull that up. 7C has a great example of finding the highest value in an array. In this example, we have 2 variables, count, that is an int, and highest, that is an int, and we initialize highest to the very first element in the array. So we're assuming that the first element is the highest element, in other words, the element that has the largest value in it. What we're going to do is iterate through the rest of the array, and we use here a 1 as the starting point for our for loop because we've already indexed into our array with a 0. So we've accessed the 0th element. We're going to start with the first element, number sub count, which will be number sub 1, using this loop. And what we're going to do inside the body of this loop is compare the value at number sub 1 to highest. So if number sub 1 is greater than what we put in highest up here, which was the first element's value, then we're going to replace it. So if we find something bigger, we will replace highest with that value that we found. Now when we hit the close curly brace, that takes us to this close curly brace, which takes us back up to our update section of our for loop. So we increment our counter, and then we compare count to size. Is count less than size? Well, that is a 2 now. Count is a 2. So yeah, 2 is less than size. So we're going to check, is number sub 2 greater than highest? So in other words, is the next element in the array greater than what we put in highest? If it is, we'll replace what's in highest with number sub 2. Then we'll hit the close curly brace for our if, close curly brace for our for loop, increment our count to 3, then we check, is number sub 3 greater than highest? So if it's not greater than highest, we don't do anything. We just go to this closed curly brace and go back up and increment our counter to 4 and then check, is 4 less than size? If it is, then we're going to compare number sub 4 to highest. If number sub 4 is greater than highest, well, we replace highest with number sub 4. So when we fall out of this loop right here in our code, we will have in our variable highest the largest element in the numbers array. My second hint says to display the name of the student who achieved the highest score, you will have to keep track of the index at which you found the highest grade. Output the student name corresponding to the index. For example, if student grade sub 2 is the highest grade, you will output student name sub 2 as the corresponding name. So back to this example in the PowerPoint. This is finding the largest value in the numbers array. But what you need to realize is that where the largest number is in the array is the subscript of where you found it. So to write this code for our assignment, we're going to need another variable here that's called index of highest. And what I want you to do is every time you find a higher number, when this is true, not only replace highest with your student grade sub I, but also replace your index of where you found it with I. Okay, I'm going to take you back over there and I'll try to help you a little bit more. It says, when the input is as shown in figure 1, your program should produce the output as shown in figure 2. So these are the student grades that we're reading in. These names, well, remember, they're initialized using an initialization list. They're in our array of strings called student name. So we're going to be using a loop to iterate through both of our arrays, outputting student name sub 0 and then student grade sub 0. This is student name sub 1. This is student grade sub 1. This is student name sub 2. This is student grade sub 2. This is student name sub 3. This is student grade sub 3. Do you see that these are parallel arrays and that each of the elements are related by their index? Okay, let's look at our coding window. Remember that you need to include your preprocessor directives. And then start your main function. And in your main method, you're going to need some variables defined. So define your variables. And remember, I kind of walked you through some of this by giving you examples from other programs. You're going to go ahead and give yourself a constant called size to use for your array size. And you're going to need to use an initialization list to get your array of strings called student name. And then you also need a student grade array. And then you need two variables. You're going to need highest score and index of highest. I'm going to go ahead and type those in so you understand what I'm saying. Now, here I want you to read in the grades from the user using a for loop. So remember, your for loop needs to go iterate through your entire array. So let me just go ahead and define your arrays for you up here. We're going to go ahead and give you a student grade array, and it needs to have size elements. And then you also need your array of strings, and that is your student name array. Remember, your student name array needs an initialization list, and you have to initialize it to the names starting with Amanda Baines. And then it was Victor Hughes, and so on. You can finish this. Okay, so after you've created those arrays, then you have the ability to create a for loop and read the values into your student grade array. Your for loops counter needs to start out at 0, and it needs to have a test section that compares your counter to the size. Remember, the last element is always 1 less than the size, so I needs to be less than size. And that's because an array's first element's index is always 0. Now you're going to be reading into your student grade array, right? Student grade sub I. Now after you've done that, then you can loop through your arrays, actually through your student grade array, and find the largest element. Let's say find the highest grade. Be sure to save the index of where you found the highest grade as well. All right, so what I'm telling you to do is start another for loop. I'm going to use this one, and I'm going to change the body. I don't want to read in a new student grade. I've already done that, right? And I want to iterate through my entire array and look for the largest value. Now remember on that example that I gave you in the PowerPoint, we initialized the highest variable to the first element in the array. So I'm going to do that before this for loop. I'm going to set my highest score variable here to the first element in my array, and the index of the highest I'm going to set to the subscript of that. So in other words, highest score needs to be student grade sub 0. That's the first element in my student grade array. And then I'm going to set my index of my highest to 0 because this is where I found the highest grade. Now remember, this is an assumption at this point. But then once I've done that, I can compare highest score to the next element in my array. So in this loop, let's start our counter out at 1, since we're going to assume that the highest element is the very first element, which has a subscript of 0. So we'll start comparing at index 1. Now what we need to do here is compare and determine whether or not the value that is in the array is larger than the value that we stored in highest score. So this if statement needs to be very much like the if statement in our example, but instead of comparing number sub count, we're going to be comparing student grade sub I to highest score. And when we find a higher score, we're going to replace our highest score with student grade sub I. All right, I want you to add that to your code. Now I skipped the output step in the loop, so I need to show you where you can output that. Right after you read in the grade, you can output the student name followed by the student grade. You already have in the student name array the data that you need. So your cout statement to output the data can happen right here. Student name sub I followed by student grade sub I. Now you're going to have to format this using the IO manipulators, left and right, and set W. So go ahead and add that and get it formatted correctly. Add your indel where necessary. I'll just do a ... so you know that we're not done here. When you fall out of this loop that you are using to find your highest score, you will have in highest score the highest element in the student grade array, the highest score, and you'll have an index of highest, or you should have an index of highest, where you found that element in the array. So therefore, you will have everything you need to output the highest score. So this is highest score. This is student name sub index of highest. Okay, so if you will save in index of highest where you find the largest element in the array, the highest score, then student name subindex of highest is the name of the person who obtained the highest score. So in other words, Lori Macbeth is the student name with the highest score. We saved both highest score and index of highest in our loop. Therefore, we can use the index of highest to index into our student name array to output the student who made the highest score. Okay, I hope these hints help you. If you have any questions, please email me. Good luck.